Hello, nerds, and welcome to this art history presentation of the 19th century. So this presentation will cover 4 different periods of art, and the first one will, of course, be Realism, as you can see on the slide. The second will bring us to Impressionism, third, Post-Impressionism, and fourth, Cubism. So find the section of the notes that starts with Realism, and let's get going. Alright, so Realism is fairly self-explanatory because the name basically tells us what we need to know about it, Realism. So what realists attempt to do is show a relatively authentic view of everyday life. We have covered everyday life going all the way back to the Dutch Baroque time period. Think of Rembrandt, Vermeer from that time period. But here we're talking about late 19th century. I should say mid to late 19th century everyday life. So for us, here are the groups that will often be depicted. We're going to see the working class. And if it's working class, it usually refers to the urban working class. So you're going to see people toiling away in factories. You're going to see people hating their lives, living in those crowded tenements. So the major context to know is the Industrial Revolution. Additionally, we're going to see a bunch of artwork that focuses on peasants. So the importance of agricultural society will still be there. Overall, it kind of is going to have a little bit of a depressing tone in the perspective of realist art. So characteristics. Folks, if you haven't worked on a farm before, it can be extremely difficult work. So it's not going to sugarcoat or romanticize the hard labor of both agricultural life and of urban life. So this is almost like a response to Romanticism, which is kind of like reminding us of the beauty of life. Realism is kind of like showing us that life can be really, really difficult. It's frankly a realist perspective. Okay, so here, a lot of Millet's are of course going to be realist. He really focused on agricultural life in France. So in this case, you have a French couple who are looking at a poor harvest. It's a really cool, like, landscape. We see a gorgeous sunset in the background, but they're clearly upset about having a poor harvest. That's a reality of life. Okay, next we have the third-class carriage. So once again, it gives us that like somber tone. Look at the muted colors the artist is using here. Like, this doesn't jump up and scream happiness whatsoever. So the third-class carriage, that's referring to the poorest section of trains. And of course, what's our context? 1862, we know train transportation is becoming the norm. And also, does it look overcrowded? That's a major characteristic of industrialism. But this is the reality. Like, if they wanted to do train travel, the best they could afford is maybe third or maybe second class for at least the average urban worker. Another Millet, once again, he really focused on agricultural life. This is probably his most famous one, The Gleaners. Again, it's not necessarily, I would say, depressing, nor is it happy. It's just like, this is what hard labor looked like in the fields. So we do see some abstractness, some, not a lot, not as much as we saw with Romanticism, definitely not nearly as much as what we will see with Impressionism and Post-Impressionism, but this is like a realistic perspective of agricultural life. It's almost like if you took a photograph of what people are doing, that's what the realist painters are trying to do here. The Potato Eaters by Vincent van Gogh. So Van Gogh, earlier in his career, and he's right at like the transition from realism to impressionism, then he's going to really be famous for his post-impressionist work. But Van Gogh has some examples of realist art, and in this case, it's muted colors. The Potato Eaters, like, what's the reality? What's the of the working class? Like, what's their diet? It's largely potatoes. Like, on average, people are eating about 10 pounds of potatoes a day because that's what they can afford, and that is what sustains them. Obviously, they still can't afford meat all of the time. Well, let's see what else we got here. The Absinthe Drinker. This is just a neat little painting. So if you don't know what absinthe is in, it can actually be clear, but it's often depicted as a green alcoholic drink. And it's one of those, like, it has a lot of misconceptions with it. People think it makes you hallucinate. I mean, frankly, all alcohol can make you hallucinate if you drink enough of it. But it's a drink that became popularized in the 19th century, and really become super popular in the 1920s in Europe and also the United States. And actually, the United States did initially ban it for a few decades, and today you can still get it at your liquor stores. But, again, like, we're starting to see a popularization of more liquors in the European diets in the 19th and 20th centuries. All right, so let's give this a read. So, exit. I don't know what's going on there. So give this a read, and then we'll continue along. All right, here we go. Okay. Style of art number 2, Impressionism. I would say definitely gotta know it. I mean, Realism is important, but Impressionism is probably more famous. Actually, definitely more famous. So, think of this, the name Impressionism. If someone says they're trying to leave an impression on you, they're trying to leave, like, the feeling, like the emotion. And once again, this is going to bring us into this idea of more abstract, the emphasis on, emotion, but it's not going to be as much as, say, post-Impressionism. So here is what you can associate with Impressionism. First of all, it's going to punch you in the face with light and color. Like, these things are meant to be colorful. And you're going to see a lot more usage of blue, and there's a reason for that, is because in the Second Industrial Revolution, they were able to synthesize paint colors. So obviously we knew blue paint was so expensive because you're going to get it from 2 different things. Now they're synthesizing paint, and it becomes much, much cheaper. What's cool about Impressionism is they're more about, like, kind of softer brush strokes, larger brush strokes, kind of like dabs of color and light. Again, really focusing on the emotion more than anything. But it's still very, not realistic, but it's understandable in its subject depiction. So, what you're going to see is it depends on the Impressionist artist, but they're going to try and paint different light patterns in the same, like, painting, and I'll show you an example of that in a bit. But I think the Impressionists are super cool, and people often like putting them in their houses because it's just so colorful and often depict happiness most of the time. So here's some major themes. So again, this is going to be into the later 19th century. So this Degas, by the way, Edgar Degas had a very, very, very problematic obsession with young ballet dancers. So a lot of his stuff is going to focus on ballet dancers. But most of the Impressionist works are going to be from the pretty late portion of the 19th century, and eventually it blurs, pun intended, into post-Impressionism. So here are some of the subjects we're going to see. So going back to how we look at art history, we often like to contextualize it. What's going on in the world that might have an impression, another pun, on the artwork. So in this case, the late 19th century is, we're starting to see, like, the working classes, and definitely the middle classes, but they've been doing that for a while now, is have this focus on leisure time. Like, people are actually using their extra time for fun. So we're going to see, scenes of people in cafes. Why do people go to cafes? That's a leisure activity, which is a major theme of the late 19th century. Some of these major European cities are building parks in the center of their cities because people like green. People like to relax. So you're going to see quite a bit of that. All right. So one of probably the most famous Impressionist of all time is Claude Monet. You're probably familiar with his lilies and the ponds and stuff like that. But here's a landscape, the poppy field. So once again, I'm looking at what's potentially the social class here. This is probably middle class. And they're just kind of taking a stroll through the field, and these other group of people right up here. So we see those dabs of light. We see that punch of color. We see multiple different lighting patterns in here. And again, we see them dressed very well. So we could probably argue that it is middle class. It's still a understandable subject, but it's a more abstract understanding of it. So this is kind of like a calming perspective on art. All right, another Monet on a cathedral. So this is a pretty sharp contrast to how we've seen previous styles of art depict architecture. Think of like Baroque and Renaissance. They wanted a little bit more, well, a lot more realistic of a perspective, but we know the Impressionists want to give us the feeling of the art more than a very realistic perspective of the art. One of my favorite paintings of all time. So Renoir is probably the second most famous Impressionist of the period, and this painting, Bal des Moulins de la Gaillette, is essentially a dance in an outdoor dance in like a cafe park region in Paris, and I think it's so cool. First, let's look at it from what social classes we see. So we see a combination of working class and middle classes. So one thing we're starting to see is the working class, they're dressing better. And the question is, why are they dressing better? Well, guess what? The Industrial Revolution, with its focus on textiles, is making cloth much more cheaply than it was before the 19th century. So lower classes now have access to better clothes. Additionally, they're engaging in what type of activity? They're dancing. Dancing is a leisure activity. Think of, I don't know, do you guys even dance in gym class anymore? But I hope so. It's a great life skill, and that's what people do for fun. What are these guys doing over here? They're drinking. They're probably flirting a little bit. Flirting with, maybe, who knows? So additionally, where else do we see the characteristics of Impressionist art? Do you see a lot of colors? Yes. Do you see dabs of light? Yes. What I think is so cool about this painting is Renoir wanted to show different types of lighting patterns in the same scene. So imagine like you're sitting in a park and it's like straight daylight, but you're sitting directly under like a big leafy tree. And think of that sunlight kind of piercing through the leaves, and it does this like dabbled light kind of thing. And so we see that, but all of a sudden, a cloud goes over the sun, or covers up the sun. And then we see that really flat, even lighting that photographers love because it's easy to photograph. And then we look at their faces here, that's that flat, even lighting. So the Impressionists tried to show all of those changing patterns of light in the same painting, which I think is really cool. So this is a great piece of art to use if you're writing about the focus on leisurely activities and how it intersects with the art of the time. All right, let's skip the video. In this case, we have a bartender in a French bar. Manet is not the same person as Monet. And what's cool about this one is what's generally behind an old-fashioned bar, a big mirror. So this is actually a reflection of the patrons here. Really cool. Another Manet. Ooh, so again, now we're getting a little more abstract here. So this is not post-impressionism yet, but it's kind of like on that cusp. So an even more of a blur, more geometric shapes, even more coarse dabs of paint. Like you feel like you can, like the artist just grabbed a glob of paint and is like just throwing it on there here in the background. But we still know what the subjects are, probably in this case middle class, engaging just a nice little, calmness, just hanging out in a park. Leisure activities, folks. Leisure activities. Box at a theater. So what's becoming popularized in the 19th century in Paris, in London, is people going to the theater. And it's not just the ultra-wealthy now. These are probably middle-class members, but the working class can afford to go to the theater. This one's cool. So pointillism it's sort of like a sub period of Impressionism and Post-Impressionism, and the name actually tells you how it's painted, so pointillism. So what the artist is doing is they're taking a really, really fine brush and like just dabbing it. It's like if I zoomed in, you can actually see the individual dabs of paint on the canvas here. But once again, here are some of the characteristics that we're seeing of the late 19th century. a growth towards more abstract. This is not like the shapes, the perspectives, they're not perfect. They're not supposed to be perfect. They didn't want them to be. But it's still like relatable. So here, a Sunday afternoon, the island of La Grande Jatte. This is actually a really small island in Paris that people would just like, it's essentially a park. So like you go there and people are kind of just like hanging out. So people with their parasols, because, you know, the sun is really hot. They're not doing it for the rain, by the way, because it's a really, really sunny day in this case. And what are they doing? They're hanging out. Look at, I gotta find one. So, do you see the boats in the background? This is a really small body of water. Like, these are not large, like little ships. So what became really common in, late 19th century Paris is like young boys would construct these like model ships, battleship sailboats, really sailboats, and they would sail them across the Seine. So the Seine is the main river in Paris, and it actually just kind of became like a cultural thing for Parisians. And actually, if you go to Paris today, you can actually pay like 20 euros and sail your own little sailboat. It's really cute. So that's actually still a thing. But once again, though, like that's leisure activity. That's like one of the realities of the Industrial Revolution, is when people aren't working on Sunday, usually, they can do things like this. All right, next period of art, Post-Impressionism. And for us, the main major person is going to be Vincent van Gogh, but Van Gogh works for me. So Post-Impressionism, more abstract than Impressionism, but we're going to see an emphasis on more geometric shapes. So it's kind of like more swirls, but with more like recognizable shapes. Additionally, besides some of Vincent van Gogh's works that we'll look at, you're going to see a lot of influence from imperialism on post-impressionist work. Gauguin is going to be the best example of that. So that's going to be our historical context. For at least the stuff that has more of a colonization context is, of course, the colonization of South Asia, Southeast Asia, Africa. Gotta know that. And by the way, since it's the late 19th century, think about what conference in Berlin in 1884, 1885 that sliced and diced Africa between European nations could have influenced the European perspective towards colonies. All right, so very similar to Impressionism, we're going to see a lot of color. It's going to punch you in the face, but it's just going to be largely more abstract. All right, so besides Van Gogh, definitely got to know Henri Toulouse-Lautrec. I bet you have actually seen his works before. You just didn't know that it was probably post-impressionism. You may have known he was French. But Toulouse-Lautrec is going to have a lot of paintings on like the dance culture in Paris of the late 19th century. Actually, I want to go to the next one because it'll be better. So you actually probably have seen this sign in my classroom. At least I have a replica of it. I don't have the real one because if I did, I would have sold it and retired. But really cool stuff. So, in Paris, they have the dance hall called Moulin Rouge. No, it's not just a movie from the early, actually, when I was in 5th grade, Moulin Rouge came out. But this is a huge dance hall where, again, middle and working class can go to in their leisure time and watch a, concert. So, Toulouse-Lautrec actually was hired to make a lot of the artwork for Moulin Rouge. So again, we see a lot of more abstract shapes. Like this is not a realistic perspective of what a guy's face looks like. It's obviously exaggerated, but it's trying to get off that mood, that emotion of excitement that going to one of these theater and concerts can give us. All right, Van Gogh. So, Van Gogh, we know Van Gogh is not French. We know he was Dutch, but he did most of his paintings in either Paris, and actually the majority of them were in the south of France. So think of like the Provence area. Van Gogh just loved going to a field and just observing and painting. What's really cool about both the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists as well is they're not painting in a studio, which for most of the artwork we've covered, that's how it's worked. They're actually putting their canvas in the field like in Paris next to that like outdoor concert and painting what they're seeing. So that's a transition, and I think it's probably a more authentic view of the emotion that they're perceiving and they're putting on a canvas. So here we have a night cafe. So again, another one of these activities that becomes popularized in the late 19th century, early 20th century is going to bars and drinking and engaging in social activities. Folks, this is social intercourse at its best. All right, most famous Van Gogh, which by the way is actually not in France or the Netherlands. Yup, it is in the MoMA in New York City, the Museum of Modern Art. And so if you're curious, we want to see this, go to New York City. You can see Starry Night. Insanely valuable painting. Like, we're talking hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars if it sold. Actually, it'd be probably closer to $1 billion if it did sell. So Van Gogh, what do we see characteristics-wise? Obviously, those swirling shapes, more abstract. Like, does this look like a realistic perspective of a beautiful starry night? No, but it hits us with, like, why people want to view a night that has no clouds. And obviously, you know, there's very limited usage of electricity at this point in time. So, like, you can see this gorgeous starry night even in major cities, which unfortunately, you know, you can't go to New York City now and look at the starry night because, you know, light pollution. So again, hitting us with that, like, kind of calmness. Such a cool painting. Love it. Okay. Another post-impressionist, no, I'd put a star on Gauguin as well. So Gauguin, for at least the history perspectives, is easier to use because the historical context is extremely obvious. So here we have Gauguin, and he actually spent a good portion of his life living in Tahiti, which was colonized. And unfortunately, his artwork kind of takes that European, like, voyeuristic perspective towards the people that are being colonized because they viewed them, frankly, as exotic, unfortunately. And that is shown in his artwork. So knowing that connection between European colonization and the effect on post-impressionism in particular is pretty important. So most of Gauguin's stuff is going to show people who were colonized. Same thing here. Okay. All right. So another period, this is, I guess actually I have 5 periods of art that I'm going to cover in this presentation, is Expressionism. So kind of post-impression, there's basically Impressionism, post-impressionism, and Expressionism are like in this same period of time. They kind of all are blurring together as my third pun of the day. But they do have distinct characteristics that do separate them. So with Expressionism, I really want you to focus on internal expression. So, like, expressing the artist's inner feelings. And for us, this is even more of an explicit, trying to capture emotions and feelings, definitely more than the realistic representation of the subject. So, this is considered the, one of the most, like, modified paintings in human history. Probably the Mona Lisa is the most, like, that's like a painting, people kind of mess with it. This is probably the second most commonly, like, modified painting in human history, which is kind of neat. So, the Scream. So, Edvard Munch, Norwegian painter, and not that many Norwegian painters we've ever discussed. And what his paintings capture is a time period that Spielvogel lightly touched upon, and he's going to continue doing it in chapter 15 as well. It's called the Age of Anxiety. So this is just the Age of Anxiety starts really like 1890s, goes in between 1890s and really 1914, the beginning of World War I. It's kind of like the Europeans are getting anxiety from, like, thinking that, you know, it's a relative time of peace, and they're kind of like, they're anxious that there might be a conflict coming up, especially when they start seeing those alliances that Bismarck set up start falling apart. And they're becoming anxious about that. And that's actually being expressed in the artwork. Additionally, some of the psychology of the time is going to have a direct impact on Expressionism. So you have to know the impact of Sigmund Freud. Freud is going to be talking about the importance of the subconscious, how it controls our brains and our thought processes. That is already anxious-inducing. The fact that your subconscious can control the way you act and think, that's depicted in the Scream here. Like, ah! Exactly. So, folks, anxiety is not a 21st century thing. It's existed forever. So we're seeing, like, up to World War I, people thinking, something's gonna happen. Well, something's gonna happen. It's called World War I. And then the age of anxiety also persists past the end of World War I. Like, World War I is gonna kill 20 million people. And that's like, society's not on this perfect progression towards happiness all the time. There's significant regressions. World wars are a good example of that. So this idea of the lost generation, those who either were killed during World War I or survived but weren't able to reacclimate into society, that's all part of this age of anxiety. So really, like 1890s, just into the 1920s is what we call the age of anxiety. And Expressionism, which is kind of right just before World War I, early 20th century, really expresses that anxiety. All right, another Munch. Again, this is literally called anxiety, folks. So even more abstract, those swirlings, we get it. Okay. All right, more Expressionism. This is actually, what's cool about some Expressionist art as well is you sometimes see some socialism infiltrating the artwork. So in this case, we do see Vive la sociale, so socialism. So the impact on the working class. I remember socialism and the working class always go hand in hand. This is actually getting kind of close to some folk art, but that will mostly be post-World War II. More Expressionism. All right. So here's what we're going to do next. We're going to find Cubism in your notes. So we're going to skippity skip. And this will be fairly short. So find Pablo Picasso. So Picasso, he got painted forever. And his style of art is going to go through many different phases, the quote-unquote periods that they often label Picasso as. But initially, his earlier art is going to be this new form called Cubism. So Cubism, again, sounds like what's depicted, so even heavier emphasis on geometric shapes. It's getting extremely abstract in the early 20th century, again, connected to that age of anxiety. Additionally, this is going to have a connection to imperialism and colonization as well. So this group of women here are actually prostitutes. So Pablo Picasso spent a good amount of time in brothels, and he actually painted some of his favorite prostitutes in this painting here. So what he's trying to do is, if you actually look at their faces, you can first see the influence of, like, African cultures on European art now. Second, he's trying to show, like, every angle of a human body on a two-dimensional plane. So, like, what Picasso would do is he'd actually, like, pose his subjects, and then he would paint them by walking around them. And he would try to show, all right, well, here's the back, but then, of course, we see, like, elements of the front side of the face, the side of the face, the back of the face, the profiles. So he's trying to show, like, a 3D perspective on a two-dimensional plane, which is kind of neat. Or a 360-degree spectrum, is what I should say. Even more cubist, geometric, girl with a mandolin. Again, we're now really starting to see the subject kind of lost, but the main idea is still there. All right, so unfortunately, we won't have time for the video profiles. Sorry, it is what it is. All right, I think that actually might be it. Oh, no, gotta do Stravinsky. Okay, so now we're going to look at abstract in orchestral form. So I think this is probably the only orchestral piece that you need to know in AP Euro, and also just as a human being, gotta know Igor Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring. So Stravinsky was a Russian composer, and he's going to create this piece that's going to really fundamentally change the music world. And full disclosure, I am essentially musically illiterate. I can't play any instruments. I dropped out of third grade violin after 2 weeks. So I'm going to do my best here, but I'm really going to focus on what the history, how it's impacting the piece here. So Stravinsky wants to separate himself from predictable rhythmic patterns that were used in the 19th century, the 18th century, and even in Baroque music as well. And he wants to make people uncomfortable. He wants to excite them. He wants their body to be filled with anxiety, be uncomfortable, and this piece is actually going to do that. It's really impressive. So it was first played in Paris in 1913, and in the famous opera there. And when it opens, people are greeted with drums, with clarinets, and let me see if I can get a photo here. And like the drums are like, and it's just like they don't have a predictable rhythm. The dancers are jumping. They're not dancing, they're jumping. And it was just like being punched in the face with something so brand new. This play in 1913 literally created a riot in Paris because it was just so, it was like so uncomfortable for the viewers, who were largely these like wealthy middle class who were expecting to like be, calmed down by an orchestral piece, not incited with rage. And again, like with the historical context, is this focus on the more abstract, and now this is affecting music as well. So highly recommend listening to Rite of Spring on YouTube. It is so awesome to listen to. I won't for the sake of just how long this presentation can go, but it's a really powerful piece in the Western music tradition. All right. So this is actually a description of the Rite of Spring. Please read it on your own. And then once you're done, you can close this out. Thanks for listening. I'll see you later, folks.